Right.
Well, comrades, you're all very welcome to this meeting of the Workers' International Network. The Workers' International Network is an organization of socialist activists across many countries in the world, and we have regular discussions on relevant topics. Tonight's meeting is about Zionism behind the myths, and we're fortunate to have as our speaker David Rosenberg of the Jewish Socialist Group. Now, the meeting is taking place at a time of immense dangers, not just in the Middle East and Israel, but across Europe and the world at large. We're witnessing a war in which 27,000 people have died, 60,000 or thereabouts are injured, and several thousand are dead under the rubble of Gaza. The International Court of Justice has been discussing whether the issue of genocide is relevant to this particular campaign by the IDF against Gaza. And they say, the International Criminal Court, that there is a case to answer. That's the case that was brought by South Africa. Now, Zionism, which is what David is going to speak about, is a very complex and it's issue, and it's important to examine it in all its facets. The issue was also contested when Zionism was first introduced as a perspective. It was contested because a lot of Jews, particularly across the European countries, were engaged in socialist activity. And many of the great leaders of the socialist movement were themselves Jews. The Bund, which was a socialist organization of Jewish comrades, was very much involved with the Russian Bolshevik Party. And Lenin refers to them a lot in his work. What is to be done? I should mention in Dublin in 1919, 1920, there was a strike by Jewish tailors, which came to be known at the time as the Tailor Soviet in Dublin, using the illustration from the Russian Revolution. We commemorated this event in 2019 within the Dublin Council of Trade Unions, of which I am president. So it's interesting that right across the globe, Jewish activists were involved in the socialist movement. And of course, things changed significantly, as will be explained, I'm sure, by David, with the Holocaust during World War II. A major, major change in the consciousness of activists and Jews across the globe. And then, of course, the Nakba, which is the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from what's now the land of Israel, and became refugees right across several countries of the Middle East. But all this will be covered in detail. Now, after David speaks in his opening contribution, there'll be time for discussion and questions, and I'd ask comrades to be a bit restrained in the time available. David, would half an hour be sufficient for your own opening contribution?
I hope so. I've been cutting it down, so I'm hoping so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And do you want me to give you a reminder at some point then?
No, I've got a clock here on my screen, so I can see. But I'll do my best to keep within that half hour.
Okay, so we'll leave it to your judgment. And thanks again, David, for agreeing to speak to this meeting. I'm looking forward to hearing your contribution.
Right. Thank you. Many thanks for inviting me to talk about histories of Zionism and anti-Zionism, and to bring that history into conversation with the present. But I want to start at the end in a way by outlining some paradoxes we can observe right now in 2024. Israel is at its most powerful and aggressive militarily, most bullying of other governments, and it has its most right-wing government ever. But in the wider Jewish world, there is more distancing from the Israeli government, more dissent from the ideology of Zionism. There is active organizing from Jews against Zionism more than any time since Israel was created in 1948, especially in Britain, Germany, the US, and Canada. I was among hundreds on the Jewish bloc yesterday when we were demonstrating on the streets about Palestine. And our bloc is made up of 11 organizations. It's cross-generational, and you've got similar things in America, particularly an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace. Many of those, but here's a paradox, many of those in the Jewish bloc who confidently identify today as opponents of Zionism, myself included, once identified ourselves as Zionists. Ideas are not fixed. An open politics that understands the reasons for people's attachments and is committed to questioning and persuasion can affect change. Despite also official clampdowns on protests within Israel, vicious policing against protesters there, physical intimidation by right-wing militias, overwhelming war propaganda, the protests in Israel are once again growing within Israel's cities. As well as Palestinians in Israeli prisons, there are also young Israeli conscientious objectors who won't join an army of occupation. Right-wing Jewish establishment bodies in Britain denounce any comparison of Israel with apartheid South Africa as anti-Semitic. But Israel's human rights bodies increasingly describe Israel and the occupied territories as one system of Jewish supremacy that meets the definition of apartheid. And Palestinians have, of course, said this for much longer. Are Jewish leaders here really saying that those Israeli human rights activists are anti-Semitic? The long-standing Palestinian chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," is described by the misnamed British Campaign Against Anti-Semitism as a genocidal anti-Semitic slogan. And yet, B'Tselem, Israel's respected human rights organization founded in the early 1980s, calls for democracy and equality from the river to the sea. The latest Israeli opinion polls show strong support for the war, but also show that the majority of Israelis do not believe that Israel can or will achieve its war goals. And there's lots of dissatisfaction with Netanyahu. One of those stated war goals was to bring back hostages, and yet the family of hostages have protested outside Netanyahu's office, saying they don't want a war of retribution, and they want him to exchange the prisoners for the hostages. Britain's chief rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, frequently condemns all anti-Zionists as anti-Semites. Yet Rabbi Adler, who was Britain's chief rabbi in 1897 when the first Zionist Congress took place, described Zionism as an egregious error. Britain's chief rabbi from 1966 to 91, Rabbi Jacobowitz, was politically close to Maggie Thatcher, but he was an outspoken critic of continued Israeli occupation. He called for relinquishing occupied territories in exchange for peace. Our mainstream press treats the current chief rabbi as a wise, politically neutral person. He's not. Part of his rabbinical training was in the occupied territories, in a seminary in the occupied territories. He still raises funds for that seminary today. He strongly supports the settlers movement. And the night before Theresa May took office as Conservative Prime Minister, she and her husband had dinner at Rabbi and Mrs. Mervis's. And Mervis himself also is only chief rabbi of one branch of Judaism. It's the largest Orthodox branch, but he doesn't represent Reform Jews, liberal Jews, progressive Jews, nor Hasidic Jews, the ultra-Orthodox, nor does he represent in any way secular Jews, who are a very large number of Jews. Some ultra-Orthodox Jews support Israel strongly and its settler movement, but most ultra-Orthodox Jews are indifferent to Zionism. They're more interested in people following the rules of Judaism than having concern for Jewish state nationalism. On the demonstrations in London, you sometimes see an extreme sect of Hasidic Jews in traditional clothes holding Palestinian flags and placards with very explicit anti-Zionist slogans. Don't get too excited, though. Palestine is their only foray into progressive politics. That particular sect, Neturei Karta, also think the Holocaust happened not because of fascism, but because Jews strayed from Judaism. They have embraced right-wing anti-Semitic movements that are also anti-Zionist, like Jobbik in Hungary. Some years ago, they joined a conference of Holocaust deniers in Iran. And while we're talking about religious-based movements, another paradox, the creation of Hamas owed much to thinly hidden Israeli encouragement and funding. In the 1980s, Sheikh Yassin, born close to Jerusalem in a village ethnically cleansed by Zionist military in 1948, was the recipient of Israeli support. When the secular PLO was making significant gains, Israel quietly nurtured Hamas as a religious political force to divide the Palestinian movement and reframe the conflict as Muslims v Jews. That movement has ultimately become Israel's Frankenstein monster that turned on them. Hamas became an elected government in Gaza. Many ordinary Gazans see it foremost as a resistance organization, fighters for freedom, but its leadership remains firmly attached to reactionary Islamist politics, alongside mainstream Palestinian demands for statehood, release of prisoners, equality. It runs Gaza in a manner that suppresses opposition and cares little for women's equality and freedom. The south of Israel, which Hamas could reach an attack on October the 7th, is largely populated by poorer and marginalized elements of the Israeli working class, whose families were often migrants and refugees from Arab countries. But they are also a group that gets politically recruited to far-right politics. Today, we think of Israel's international support principally from the US, but the US was actually quite lukewarm about Israel until the early 1960s. It was concerned about its relationship with the oil-producing Arab states. In the late 1940s, early 50s, the USSR was more openly supportive of Israel. But paradoxically, at home, anti-Semitic repression reached an ugly pinnacle in 1952 with the imprisonment and execution of many leading Yiddish cultural figures. The last of these couple of paradoxes I'll mention. Political Zionism was created in 1897 in a plush concert hall in Basel, Switzerland, by a secular Hungarian Jew, Theodor Herzl, living and working in Vienna. But Zionism remained a minority opinion in Jewish life globally until the Holocaust. 1897 was also the year that Jewish workers in the Tsarist Russian Empire formed the Bund, an internationalist socialist workers' organization that was firmly anti-Zionist. Finally, on paradoxes, the fundamental Zionist argument for a Jewish state was that it would end anti-Semitism. Yet it attributes every criticism of Israeli policy, every questioning of Zionism, as examples of growing anti-Semitism in the world, the very thing it was supposed to eradicate. All of these paradoxes should warn us against making simplistic analyses, but a deeper awareness of them should help us strategize more clearly about what might be effective ways to campaign for change. I want to spend the rest of my talk developing some arguments around some key historical moments and episodes, including lesser known aspects of how Zionism and anti-Zionism developed. And I'm going to start with a little detour to Poland, where in 2013, a wonderful museum called Polin opened in the heart of what was, in the early 1940s, the Warsaw Ghetto. And that museum showcases 1,000 years of Jewish life and interaction with Poland's non-Jews, periods of terror and hardship, also golden ages, in which the country, in a country that was home in the 1930s to Europe's largest Jewish community, 3.3 million Jews, who were more than 10% of the entire Polish population. And in many cities at that time, in the 30s, including Warsaw, Jews constituted more than a third of the population. The USSR at the time had about 2.5 million Jews. Of those 3.3 million Polish Jews, 3 million were murdered by the Nazis. Only one part in the museum focuses on the 6 years of annihilation. Essentially, it's about 1,000 years of life and at key times of political struggle. One room there has this compelling multimedia display that marks the late 19th century, when most Polish Jews lived under Tsarist rule and suffered discrimination and physical terror, but new radical ideas emerged promising liberation and self-determination. The Zionist idea of self-determination in Palestine was only one among several put forward, territorial and non-territorial. Um, Herzl believed, he hoped that the large Jewish communities of Eastern Europe would be persuaded en masse to take the Zionist path. But Zionism was challenged from day one by Jews who advanced alternative ways to build equal lives as a minority where they were, whether centered on religious identity, secular cultural autonomy, or integration strategies, some of which overlapped with struggles for socialism or multicultural liberal democracy. The strongest early challenge to Zionism came from the Bund, who did not believe in a separatist solution to any of these issues. Bundist values were diametrically opposed to Zionism, optimism versus pessimism, internationalism versus nationalism, integration versus isolation and evacuation. The Bund accused Zionists of worshipping the same nationalist values as regimes that oppressed Jews and other minorities. They also accused them of diverting Jews from class struggle, and it was class struggle that the Bund saw as the only way to end anti-Semitism and other racial oppression. The Bund looked for solidarity in the emerging workers' movement and revolutionary movement as the way forward. Herzl went off looking for imperial sponsors. You will know of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, but that wasn't Herzl's first imperial post of call. In 1903, Herzl turns up in Russia and he wants to find one of the leaders of the Bund because he knows that the Bund is the leading anti-Zionist force. He finds a Jewish revolutionary and asks him, he says, "Do I have the honor of speaking to the leader of the Bund?" The person he spoke to was called Chaim Zhitlowski, who says, "No, I'm not in the Bund. I'm a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party." He was one of the SRs. But he said to Herzl, he knows the Bund very well. And then Herzl tries to convince him of this idea that Herzl had, where the Russian government would make a kind of charter for Palestine and support the charter for Palestine. But the deal was that the Jews had to give up their revolutionary struggles for 15 years. And Herzl said, if at the end of those 15 years, the Russian charter for Palestine has not come to anything, you'll be free to carry on. It's not such a great deal. The Zhitlowski, he says in Yiddish, es ist mir geworden finster vor die Augen. It means it grew dark before my eyes. You know, and he thought this was a hopeless thing. He says we are not Zionists. We do not believe that Zionism is able to resolve our problem. To transfer the Jewish people from Russia to Palestine is in our eyes a utopia, and for the sake of utopia, we will not renounce the path of revolutionary struggle against the Russian government, which will also lead to the freedom of the Jewish people. Zionists did win some support among ordinary Jews in both Eastern and Western Europe, but more among the wealthier classes. There's a story passed down through Bundist circles that illustrates this from the early 20th century in the Russian Empire, where Jewish workers largely worked for Jewish employers. Nearly all the Jews were forced to live in the western lands of Imperial Russia, called the Pale of Settlement. And in this story, an employer is facing a strike over pay demands from his workers. And he comes out onto the balcony of his factory to address the workers below. And he told them he can't meet their wage demands. If they carry on with them, he will jump off the balcony to his death. The workers respond, "Jump, you Zionist bastard. Wir wollen schicken die Beine in Palästina. We will send your bones to Palestine." And that was an illustration of that class struggle. The Zionist movement had their major success with Lord Balfour in Britain. Many Jews in Britain still celebrate Balfour as this friend of the Jews. He wasn't. 12 years before the Balfour Declaration, he oversaw Britain's first modern peacetime immigration law, known as the Aliens Act, specifically designed to reduce the flow of East European Jewish migrants and refugees into Britain. The campaign for that was led by a populist anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic street organization in East London called the British Brothers League. The foot soldiers of that were working class poor and unemployed, but the people in control were Balfour's fellow conservatives, including Major William Evans Gordon, the Conservative MP for one of the East London seats. Balfour and Evans Gordon were both close associates of a Russian-born Zionist ideologue, an academic scientist called Chaim Weizmann, who later became the first president of the State of Israel. But Balfour and the British state, for them, it was first and foremost about Britain's imperial interests. Balfour was typical of a layer of the upper class in Britain who were anti-Semites by temperament, but drawn to Christian Zionism, happy for Jews to be sent to Palestine, not much less keen on them living as next-door neighbours. He was part of a social set drawn to conspiracy theories about Jews and the Russian Revolution, and Churchill and the leading figures in the Tory press were also part of that. In 1920, Churchill wrote an article where he claimed that internationalist Jews were engaged in a worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization. This movement amongst the Jews is not new, from the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx down to Trotsky, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement, and now this band of extraordinary personalities has gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads, become undisputed masters of that enormous empire. There is no need to exaggerate the part played in the creation of Bolshevism by these international atheistical Jews. It is a great one. It probably outweighs all others. With the notable exception of Lenin, the majority of its leading figures are Jews. The principal inspiration and driving power comes from Jewish leaders. But in that piece of writing, he also heaps praise on nationalist Jews. Weizmann urged these politicians to support nationalist Jews against the internationalist Jews. Meanwhile, the Times ran anti-communist editorials about with one called The Jewish Peril. On 8th of May 1920, it wrote about this book, The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which was a forgery to try and show a Jewish meeting minutes of an alleged Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. And the Times editorial said, are they a forgery? If so, when came the uncanny note of prophecy, prophecy in part fulfilled? This was the Times, 1920. Interestingly, the Balfour Declaration was denounced by some members of the Anglo-Jewish aristocracy. And the Board of Deputies, central to Zionist propaganda today in Britain, was led until the end of the 1930s by non-Zionist and anti-Zionist Jews who feared that support for Jewish nationalism would undermine their patriotic British status and undermine their rights as a minority in Britain. Zionism also appealed among idealist middle-class youth, Jewish youth, both in Eastern and Western Europe, who followed a captivating but flawed ideology that socialist Zionism posited. That it said that Jews had a peculiar class structure, an abundance in intermediary roles and marginal self-employed roles between the working class and the wealthy capitalists. And they needed to normalize their class structure. And they could only do that in their own national state, where Jews would be working in factories and also on the land, and would carry through a socialist struggle there against the capitalists. But what about the indigenous Palestinian workers and peasants? There were no satisfactory answers to that question. In the biggest communities of Eastern Europe, the class structure was changing anyway. In 20s and 30s in revolutionary Russia, where discriminatory employment and residency restrictions for Jews were lifted, the economy began to run on more socialist lines and Jews were spread across different areas of work. In capitalist Poland, an independent state again from 1918, for economic and political reasons, the Jewish community became much more proletarianized. And one of the Bund's leaders in 1930s semi-fascist Poland, when ultimately the Bund emerged as the strongest and popular political force among Poland's Jews, was Henryk Ehrlich. And these are a few quotes from him. The Zionists regard themselves as second-class citizens in Poland. Their aim is to be first-class citizens in Palestine and make the Arabs second-class citizens. There is a certain kind of Jewish nationalism, just as ugly, just as disgusting as the nationalism of other nations. If an appropriate opportunity arose, Jewish nationalism would show its sharp teeth and nails, no less than the nationalism of other nations. If a Jewish state should arise in Palestine, its spiritual climate will be eternal fear of the external enemy, brackets, Arabs, eternal struggle for every foot of ground, for every bit of work with the internal enemy, bracket, Arabs. Is this a climate in which freedom and democracy and progress can grow? Is it not the climate in which reaction and chauvinism ordinarily flourish? Zionism has always been a conjoined twin of anti-Semitism and every kind of national chauvinism. Zionism has always regarded the law of force of nationalist reaction as the normal law of history. The last test of Jewish political opinion in Poland before the Nazi invasion were the national municipal elections of 1938 and 39, and the Bund outstripped the Zionists and the religious parties in those by a very large margin. In Warsaw, 20 Jewish councillors were elected, 16 of them were from the Bund. Similar results from Lodz and other big cities. Outside of Europe, the largest Jewish communities were in America. In the interwar period, Jewish involvement in trade union political struggles in communist and socialist movements there was high. Zionists were struggling to make headway among Jewish workers there. Zionists often say that it was Israel's creation that gave all Jews more self-confidence, enabled Jews to fight back against their tormentors. It's a myth. In 1930s Britain, the huge clash with fascism at Cable Street in the East End that prefigured, and that was prefigured by clashes in Manchester and Leeds. In all of these, the Jews that were mobilized essentially by the Communist Party, who were a non-Zionist or anti-Zionist political force, and also the Labour League of Youth, and also by trade union bodies, and also a very interesting local organization in the Jewish community called the Workers' Circle. These were the people. There were some Zionists involved with those battles, but mainly they were marginal to it. Jews also fought against fascism well before Israel was created by being part of the international brigades in Spain. It's reckoned that 15% of the fighters there were Jewish, recruited in countries where Jews were less than one, were Jews from 1% or less of the population. Now, I'm looking at the time. How much time have I got? Have I got 6 or 7 minutes?
It's very, very interesting, David. So continue. I mean, it's a very, very valuable contribution. Say another 10 minutes, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, that will easily be enough for me. Okay. In Poland in 1926, Marshal Pilsudski led a military coup, and he was a former socialist. And ironically, many Jews welcomed his leadership after a series of weak governments. They also thought that his leadership would keep the far right anti-Semites at bay. Um, somebody's got their. Oh, is it possible to mute? Um, um, yeah, yeah. A lot of Jews thought that he would, if you had Pilsudski government, a strong government, it would keep the far right at bay. After Pilsudski died in 1935, the far right, openly anti-Semitic parties became far more prominent, and they were pogrom inciting parties. There was very openly anti-Semitic parties. The anti-fascist fight was led by two forces, the Bund and the left wing of the Polish Socialist Party, who collaborated together. The Zionist groups were absent from this fight, except for one small faction in the 30s called Left Polition. In general, the Zionists were busy concentrating on a future in preparing for a future in Palestine. But even more conspicuous by absence was the Polish Communist Party, who about 40% of their members were Jewish, but they were so busy in internecine political warfare with the Bund over trade unions, and the trade unions were the more dominant part of the left movement. And the Communist Party were not above doing physical attack on the Bundists in this period when the anti-Semites were running rampant. Many commentators recognize the significance of the surge in popularity of the Bund in the late 30s as being to do with their fight against anti-Semitism, ideologically and physically. But this had wider sources. The Bund created a world of institutions in Poland: schools, libraries, sports groups, drama groups, discussion circles. It had lots of media outlets, including a daily newspaper. And it also put forward a very sophisticated argument for multiculturalism, an anti-nationalist state, full equality, dignity, and respect for minorities. And left groups trying to recruit the Jews outside of the Bund merely offered the mainstream left arguments with an added call to assimilate. But identity was important. I was going to give you an Isaac Deutscher quote there, but I won't. I'll leave that. Maybe it will come up in discussion in some way. But to illustrate that. But the last word, last words I'll say on Poland. My favorite display in the Polin Museum I mentioned is a room that depicts the movements among Jews in the 30s, and it says in the Bund section, "Bund builds, Zionism destroys." In the ghetto, this especially the largest one, the Warsaw Ghetto, those warring political factions, Bundists, communists, and Zionists, are thrown together. And though there was still a lot of political mistrust, a fighting unity was established, culminating in the incredible Warsaw Ghetto uprising that lasted nearly a month. And there were more other short-lived uprisings inspired by that. The overall commander of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was Mordechai Anielewicz, a left-wing Zionist. Second in command was Marek Edelman, a Bundist who survived and died in Poland in 2009. Before we leave this period, I want to touch on a controversial issue, an area that has caused a lot of controversy: the response of Jews in Nazi Germany and the claims of Nazi Zionist collaboration. This got the left-wing politician Ken Livingstone in a lot of trouble a few years ago. Unfortunately, Livingstone drew his material from a very second-rate, hyperbolic source, Lenny Brenner's book, Zionism in the Age of Dictators, which uses testimony that fits his theory, but ignores countervailing testimonies. There have been much more sophisticated studies that show there were Jews who sought to make deals with Nazis. Zionists were prominent among them, but other Zionists denounced them for doing so. There were Jews who tried to save themselves and those close to them by various dealings. But the fault line on that wasn't Zionist, anti-Zionist. Class was also a factor. There was a deal known as the Havara Agreement in August 33, 7 months after the Nazis came to power, by which some 60,000 Jews were permitted to relocate to Palestine with a small proportion of their assets. and this happened over a number of years. But at the height of the war, as Axis powers expanded towards the Middle East, they were defeated at El Alamein. There's no reason to believe that had the Nazis reached Palestine, they would have spared those Jews who who were benefited from the Ha'avara agreement. In the wake of the Holocaust, there was enormous political sympathy for Zionist political demands in the West, strengthened much more among Jewish communities in Britain and America by the period 1945 to 48, when hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors in displaced persons camps were unwanted in the West. And many in those DP camps looked towards Palestine as a place of refuge. And Jewish minorities, unable to help those refugees, became very emotionally drawn towards Zionism and didn't question what Israel's creation would mean for the people already living in Palestine, about to undergo ethnic cleansing. Um, and the Bund was decimated in the Holocaust, during which its members played a key role in ghetto resistance. Its post-war remnants were scattered in different countries, but even though they were politically marginalized, they were still doing what they could. Here's a statement from Bundists in New York in 1947 about the partition of Palestine. The peaceful coexistence of Jews and Arabs must be brought about by the renunciation of the Zionist goal of an independent Jewish state on the part of the Jewish community, and by the Arabs' recognition of the democratic principle that a country belongs to its entire population. Palestine should thus be regarded as belonging both to Arabs and the Jews. Palestine should become an independent state. Its freedom and equal rights of its communities should be internationally guaranteed. And what we know of what happened is that one refugee problem was solved through a war of ethnic cleansing that created another huge injustice and refugee problem. Last comments I want to make, which are about after post-war. Especially from the 1960s onwards, Zionism became a dominant ideology in Jewish life in Britain. This coincided with a relative improvement in the material lives of many Jews, who became more suburbanized and middle class. In Jewish educational institutions, synagogues and Sunday schools, summer camps, pro-Zionism and Hebrew culture became the norm in the 1950s and 60s. The Jerusalem program, adopted in 1968, sought to turn a generalized sympathy towards Israel into among Jews, diaspora Jews, into an imperative. It promoted a political stance, asserting the centrality of Israel in Jewish life, and its bond to the historic homeland, the land of Israel. And the first Jerusalem program had mainly, in the early 50s, spoke mainly of ingathering the exiles, but this was going much, much further, the centrality of Israel in Jewish life. In the Zionist project in Palestine set about the erasure of Palestinian history through building on and renaming Palestinian villages, ethnically cleansed in the wars of 48 and beyond. And more widely, the Zionist project began to downgrade and ideologically erase long-standing Jewish diaspora cultures and languages and powerful Jewish alternatives to Zionism. I think I'll stop there. I have got more, but hopefully I can. But I just want, we know quite a lot about what has happened since. But what I really wanted to say is that things are very much in a period of flux and change inside the Jewish community. Yeah, where you've got people pushing is polarizing, but the left is growing stronger. The right is very loud, but a lot of Jews are kind of in the middle of that, who are feeling very unhappy, confused. They know what Israel is doing is absolutely wrong, but they, between that and coming out on a demonstration about it is quite a big step, though we've seen a lot of people start to take that step. Yeah, but I'll leave it there and hopefully be able to add a few points in response to questions and discussion.
Thank you, David. I'm sure all the comers will agree that that was a very informative, very interesting, and a very valuable contribution. Now, lots of comrades here will want to contribute to the discussion in the form of questions or individual contributions. So I want to ask a few things of you. First of all, it's not necessary to repeat points that David has made. By all means, contest whatever argument you wish, but there's no need to go over the points that David has made himself very clearly. Can you also restrain yourselves in terms of time? And the idea is to ensure as many comrades as possible can come into the discussion and can ask questions. After a few questions have been asked, we'll give David an opportunity to answer during the course of the discussion some of the points, and then the discussion can take up again at that point. And at the very conclusion then, David will have an opportunity to summarize the discussion. So if comrades who wish to speak would use the electronic indicator that would raise your hands, and it'll give me some idea about what the order of speakers would be. So the first speaker is Steve Zeltzer, but anybody else who wishes to speak, just put up your electronic hand and I'll be able to direct the discussion from there. So Steve, you're next.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that I missed a part of the report, but I think that the role of Zionism has to be looked at historically. It didn't start with the rise of fascism. The Zionist movement and the Zionist ideology collaborated with imperialism, British imperialism, and then U.S. imperialism, with Nazis, with fascism, and then with U.S. imperialism. And in the labor movement, in the unions in the United States, the Zionists worked with the trade union bureaucracy. In fact, during the witch hunt in the 50s, they collaborated in the anti-communist witch hunt. So the other thing is the Zionists did work with the Nazis. They brought Adolf Eichmann to Palestine to get the support of the Nazis. In fact, they were given an award. So I don't agree that that doesn't mean every Zionist worked with the Nazi, but the Zionists were politically aligned with the Nazis, and for the purpose of establishing a Jewish state. So today, the Zionists play in the labor movement in the United States a role of supporting U.S. imperialism, supporting the bombing of Gaza, and blocking U.S. workers from organizing in support of the Palestinian people. They play a pernicious role, and they are anti-communists, the Zionists. So I think that this idea that the Zionists play a neutral role or something like that in relationship to imperialism, the relationship to internationalism, is really wrong. Internationally, they supported South Africa, the Histadrut, which is AFL-CIO is affiliated with. They supported the apartheid regime, and they work with the United States and Israel all over the world, supporting fascist right-wing. They supported Pinochet. They supported the Argentinian coup. So we're talking about a very dangerous, pernicious movement in the working class, because they are in unions internationally, and they work with the CIA and collaborate with the CIA. So I think you have to take a look at the Zionism and the labor movement in relationship to their history and their role today, which is reactionary. It's a reactionary ideology which has to be confronted in the working class, and workers have to be educated about the role of the Histadrut, which is not just a union, but has businesses that are involved internationally in supporting right-wing reactionary regimes.
Thank you, Steve. The next person that indicated to want to speak is David Hempson. There you go, Dave.
Sorry, let me just show my face so I'm not anonymous. First of all, thank you very much from a David to another David. That was a marvelous introduction with many parts which invite you to read more widely and to really understand much of the phenomenon. My points are going to be limited, as per advice by the chair, to some specifics in relation to apartheid and Zionism. And particularly, you touched on a question of what you mentioned as Christian Zionism. And it leads to the perverse result that you can have Zionism being supported by Christians who are actually anti-Semitic and who actually are also Islamophobic, although that's a nice expression, who are violently opposed to Muslims. So that in some cities in America, you have outbursts of anti-Semitism. I don't mean just nasty words. I mean killing of people in synagogues and so forth, horror after horror, at the same time with attacks on people identified as Muslims. So we find that reaction blurs right across any logical spectrum. And this is the danger which we see, particularly in the rise of the ultra-right, which some people may feel is not such a danger, but it is. It's a deeply corrosive danger because it blurs the other right across the spectrum. And the base for Trump is both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic. It's the same phenomenon. And it has devastating results at times. But that's one point. If I could then mention just some personal observations in relation to Zionism and apartheid. Now, you know that in Resolution 3379 of the United Nations made that direct comparison. It was carried by the United Nations General Assembly and then reversed subsequently. But it identified Zionism as a form of racism. Now, without going into all the complications of what exactly racism is, it led, what it was identifying was a fusion of Zionism with the support for the apartheid regime. Just to mention some specifics. In 1979, when I visited Israel late in that year, I noticed on the roofs of houses, SABS. SA is South Africa. BS is the Bureau of Standards, and the CSIR, which is the Council of Science and Industrial Research. And that was on the roofs of houses. That was the solar heating, solar water heating systems which were applied in South Africa. Now, that was a direct exchange for rockets from Israel, which South Africa then, the apartheid regime then perfected. In 1979, in 1979, also in South Africa, there was a nuclear trial in which the Israeli secretly in an alliance with South Africa, exploded a bomb. That was on the 22nd of September, 1979. And it exposed this link. Both regimes had various arms embargoes against them. And so therefore secretly collaborated and built up a defense armaments industry, which was peculiar to each other and supported each other. And then we do face the point which Steve has raised, which is that the Histadrut is still regarded as part of the labor movement internationally. I think in the ICFTU, it was a major component. In current trade union international circles, I think it's still very, very active. Now, I know that sometimes we see that Histadrut over time has amended itself and allowed Arab workers and so forth, Palestinian workers, to have membership. But overall, it is an integral part of the apartheid Israeli state. And it makes no apologies for this. So that the Zim shipping line, I didn't know this, but actually is indirectly owned by the Histadrut, which is meant to be a labor movement organization. I just make these observations, but thank you again, David, for some very interesting points.
Thank you, David. Roger.
Yes, first of all, thank you, David. That was a really interesting and comprehensive introduction. I'd just like to add a few more points and a few quotes, which I think might illustrate some of his points. First of all, I mean, in the period, but right up until the time of the Holocaust, as David said, Zionism was just a exotic fringe sect. I think you could compare it perhaps to in the USA at one time among the black population there was Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa sect, which or even the Rastafarians in the Caribbean and so on. The idea that we could go back to a homeland and so on, but it never became a mass force. And certainly in Eastern Europe, in the ghettos, as you say, I mean the response overwhelmingly of the Bund, which was a massive, really a marvelous creation culturally, politically, in every way. The attitude of the Bundists was, we're going nowhere. This is our home. And so what we've seen with the latest with this genocide in Gaza, which has created, of course, absolute revulsion and horror throughout the world. And by the way, that shows very much that people don't get brainwashed by the press to any extent, to anything like the extent that is sometimes alleged, because we've seen a massive uprising, almost upsurge of protest. But unfortunately, also part of that is that among some fringes within the protest movement, I'm afraid it's true to say that anti-Semitism, it has breathed life into some anti-Semitic myths. On the internet, I've seen so many things. I've seen somebody who in other respects considered himself left, who said, "How can I ever discuss anything with a Jew again?" Absolutely, I mean, something that you would not say. People who would have protested vigorously about Islamophobic reactions to, say, 9/11. I've seen people, somebody who said, now I understand why the German working class was not worried about the Holocaust, as if somehow the Holocaust was justified by what was done 2 or 3 generations later by Israeli fascists. I won't quote any more, but the question is, oh, sorry, one other thing, that there's been lots of discussion about whether Jews genetically had their origin in Palestine or not. So bloody what? It absolutely makes no difference. It's got nothing to do with genetics. Zionism, as David explained, was a tool seized on by British imperialism. It was done in order to create an outpost within the turbulent oil-rich region to protect its control of the oil fields against the Arab Revolution and its control at that time of the Balfour Declaration, at that time of Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the sea route to India. In the words of the first British military governor of Jerusalem, it would be, quote, "a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism." So very, very explicitly, it was a question of divide and rule and manipulating and exploiting the hardships of persecuted Jews in order to serve its own interests. Everywhere in the world, by the way, I mean, there's so many communal conflicts which are the direct creation of British imperialism, whether you take India, Ireland, Sri Lanka, Cyprus, etc., etc., etc. So I'd like to quote one thing. There was somebody read the book by Herzl, who was the founder of Zionism, as David said, who said, and this is what he said when he read the book: "The book interested me very much. Somehow this book touched a chord in me, and I took it all in." Who was the author? Adolf Eichmann. And he continued, "The Zionists wanted a territory where the Jewish people could finally settle in peace, and that was pretty much what the Nazis wanted." This is, of course, the man who went on to be the architect of the Holocaust. So in a way, you could say Zionism was an acknowledgement of despair, a capitulation to anti-Semitism. And in that sense, you could say the genocide in Palestine today is yet another aftershock of the failure of the German Revolution of 1918 to 23. One more point that I would like to make is in relation to the slander by the right wing of the Labour Party of anti-Semitism among the left and among of Corbyn and his supporters. It was actually Herbert Morrison, Peter Mandelson's grandfather, who blocked entry to Britain by Jews fleeing from Nazi genocide. And it was Labour's right-wing Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, who drowns destitute Holocaust survivors from the detention camps in the Mediterranean, just as they're drowning refugees in the Mediterranean, now going in the opposite direction. When people think, I mean, when it's talked about as if the Jews sort of went to Palestine just on a whim or in some kind of fiendish conspiracy, I'd like to quote one of the survivors, one of the displaced persons surviving the concentration camps at the time in 1947. He said, "There are thousands more like me. My story is the story of my entire generation as Jews. I'm 28 and I've never eaten bread I've earned with my own hands. This shirt I wear was given me by the Red Cross. This coat I wear came from the partisans. This sweater from my sisters in Palestine. My uncle in the United States sent me a dollar bill and I bought these boots I wear. During the war, I was in the ghetto. Later on, I joined the partisans and I was called the Jew. As the war was over, I returned to my town. Of 7,000 Jews, 2 small children remained. This is all that remains of my family. One went to the war, one was taken prisoner and killed by the Germans. All the rest were slaughtered by Poles. I don't even know their graves." And he went on like that. But I mean, it was not a question of these survivors. They weren't going there in order to terrorize the Palestinians or to grab their land or anything. They were going because they needed somewhere to live. And one of the reasons why Britain supported the creation of Israel was because they didn't want them to come to Britain. All these thousands of Holocaust survivors who were languishing in the displaced persons camps at the time. What I'd just like to finish by saying is, I mean, it's not a unique thing. I've seen somebody again on the internet said the genocide in Gaza is, and this was a direct quote, the worst atrocity in human history, which I think is overlooking quite a few other atrocities in human history. But the fact is that there are parallels to what happened. It's what is happening in Palestine today is can be compared to what happened in the USA, in Canada, in South America, in South Africa, in Australia, in New Zealand. It's a settler population which is waging war on an indigenous population, and it's horrific and it's absolutely monstrous. But it's not unique. It's not something special. It's something for which there are many precedents. So I'd just like to finish by saying one more thing. What is the solution? I would say neither. I mean, you don't want to get too much into this, but I don't think either one state or 2 states, which are the 2 options that are being offered at the moment. I don't think either of them actually is quite what the socialists should be arguing for now. I think we have to remember that following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, British and French imperialists ruthlessly carved up the region by drawing arbitrary lines on the map. That's the so-called Sykes-Picot plan. And sectarian conflicts have raged not only in Israel, Palestine, but in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, in Jordan, and so on. And I think we should be calling for a common homeland of all communities in a harmonious socialist federation of the Middle East. Thanks, comrades. Sorry if I went on a bit long.
Thank you, Roger. Just before our next speaker, Andros, speaks, I want to just raise a couple of questions myself, not to make a contribution, but raise questions. First of all, we have to be optimistic about developments in society at large, but also within Israel. We need to examine Israel as a class society, riven by divisions between capitalists and workers, like any other capitalist country. And as David referred to, poor people, or the poorer section of society, are sent to the borderlands in Gaza or close to Lebanon, and also the settler areas as well. Because of the housing crisis and the cost of housing in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, people are given facilities and support by the state to live in the settlements, which is land stolen from Arabs. So these divisions exist. It's a very class-divided society, I believe, with a huge difference in standards between rich and poor. We made a visit to Israel and Palestine about 6 or 7 years ago, and we met the B'Tselem group and, for example, the Breaking the Silence group. The B'Tselem group are Jewish people who assist Arabs and Palestinians in their struggle with the Israeli state and highlight breaches in human rights. Breaking the Silence group are ex-Israeli soldiers who have highlighted and exposed in terms of photographs and interviews the stuff that they were made carry out under orders from the IDF. The Breaking the Silence group had an exhibition of photographs in Dublin a couple of years ago, which is very interesting. And just one final point in relation to divisions. I understand that there were united strike action between Jewish and Palestinian dockers in the Haifa region historically. That region of employment has created unity, but also in the construction industry. Jewish and Arab workers have also come together to form newer unions. So it's not just history does, but they formed unions within the construction industry. And it's worth noting also that the wall and the settlements and all these places which are evidence of exploitation by the state were built by Palestinian workers who came into Israel as just day laborers or were given temporary rights to continue there. So the work is being done by Arabs, by Palestinian workers, and there have been instances of unity between them and Jewish workers historically. And of course, there was a huge movement against Netanyahu before the war broke out in Gaza, where the unions called a general strike against the regime. So there are discontents and divisions within Israeli society. And I'm raising these questions just to inquire of comrades, could they in some way illustrate these points or develop the arguments along these lines? Oh, I forgot to mention the issue of Christian Zionism. The rise of evangelical Christians in the US is a big assistance to Trump in his campaign. He draws on that. And there's some apparently biblical references or some reliance on biblical references that when the Jews return to the land of Israel, the end of days, as they call it, is around the corner. And those who wish to be present, which is very much a live issue in the evangelical group, they want to be there when the end of days arrives. So they try to encourage Jews to go back to Israel to speed up the process when their God will destroy the entire world. So whatever about the mythologies of that, Trump is drawing on that kind of evangelical Christian tradition as well. So these are just questions I'm raising. Now, the next speaker was Andros, to be followed by Nigel. Andros.
Sorry, yes, I was muted. There was one point which Comrade David left for the end in his very interesting introduction, in which he said that there are many Jews in the middle, although they don't express themselves in any kind of active way, but actually that these developments, this conjuncture, the left is growing stronger. I would like to hear more about that, because this is really interesting and an important position. What is the state of the left in Israel today, and how is it growing stronger? One second question I have is that my impression is that until a few decades ago, the ruling class in Israel was divided over the issue of Zionism. But it seems that today, the ruling class is wholly, let's say, endorsing the Zionist ideology. I'm not sure that this is correct, but it's an impression I have. So I'm asking if this is accurate. One point I would like to put in this discussion, it was raised by other comrades before, but is that is the role of British imperialism in particular, but of imperialism in general, in the creation of the Israeli state. There is a lot of talk against Zionism in our countries, in the population, in West and East and North and South. But it seems to be forgotten that the state of Israel was created by British imperialism for specific purposes. And I think this is something we have to bring up again and again and strongly. On the one hand, to get rid of the Jews, which shows how, the hypocrisy about their pretend to be fighting against anti-Semites today, but also to create an outpost in the Middle East. Another point I want to put in this discussion is that the far right, which has traditionally been anti-Semite, is now pro-Zionist, or big sections of it, big elements of it. In Greece, where I come from, is the dominant current. The far right, including Nazi organizations and fascist organizations, they are pro-Zionist. They want Israel to defeat and slaughter Gaza and vanish Palestinians from the face of the earth, which says a lot about the far right, of course, but also says a lot about Zionism, that they have ended up in some kind of not coalition, but agreeing on the purpose. The expression apartheid is widely used in the discussions about Palestine. I think it's a correct term to use, but I think it creates the impression. I don't really have time to develop this point, but I'm raising it for discussion and for, let's say, food for thought. There is also a discussion that in the same way as South Africa was able to peacefully solve the problem of apartheid, maybe the same thing can happen in Israel today. I personally don't think that this is possible in the foreseeable future. Of course, what will happen in 50 years is impossible to predict. But let's say that in the historical phase that we are going through, I don't see any possibility of find an agreeable solution by which, in peace, the Israeli state is able to embrace the Arabs, Palestinians, and have a unified state, as happened in South Africa, where, of course, they pass over power to the black majority, in essence, in practice, the black capitalists. I don't see this possibility in the case of Palestine. The class approach is the only way to solve the problem, but of course it's far away because we don't have a socialist forces, either in Palestine or in Israel, sizable, I mean, or in the rest of the Middle East, Middle Eastern countries. Despite this is the only perspective forward. Then I would like to make some. I'm not sure about my time, Finn, but so if I'm going to just cut me.
You don't have a huge amount of time left, Andros, so just be restrained.
Okay.
But continue.
Yeah. We co-organized with a number of other organizations a feminist public meeting in Athens couple of weeks ago, in which many people spoke from different organizations, and 3-4 Palestinians from Palestine, from the West Bank on video, etc., and some Palestinian women present there. Of course, initially it was a very emotional thing, which is understandable. But then our comrade and another person from another feminist collective, they put the class position, but in a very concrete way, giving examples of what has been taking place in the two communities of Palestinian and Jewish Israeli women getting together, of common associations of Jewish and Arab workers, etc. And one of them was is a film producer, and she described in very concrete ways how she had visited both sides, the Palestinian occupied territories and Israel, and gave vivid descriptions of the struggle of a minority, of course, of Israeli Jewish people struggling against the regime, etc. And this was very good, but to our surprise, to a certain extent, the Palestinians present reacted in a very hostile manner, saying that this is about defending the Palestinian women. We should have no references to other, meaning Jewish women, Jewish organizations. In other words, they took a very nationalist position against Jews. We can describe it an anti-Semitic position, etc. And this is very dominant in the Arab masses and in sections of the left. And of course, we had to argue against it in a very, very friendly way. But it's a real problem. I'm not sure which comrade was mentioning. I think it was David Hempson, that the idea of creating the state to fight anti-Semitism is ending up strengthening anti-Semitism in various sections of the population internationally. I have very strong doubts, to finish, about using the slogan, Free Palestine from the river to the sea, although David, in his introduction, kind of defended it, because it is interpreted today as wanting to destroy the state of Israel. And I think that this is something that we have to fight against, because there are sections of the left that make it very specific. They say, destroy the state of Israel, all the Jews, throw the Jews into the sea. We need to take very clear a position against this kind of ideas, which are very dangerous, precisely because they undermine any possibility of a class approach, a class unification of the struggle of Jewish Israeli workers and Palestinian workers. Sorry if I took long, comrades.
Thank you, Andros. Very interesting points there. Now, the next four speakers who've indicated in this order are Nigel, Julia, Kieran, and Dominic. So before these four comrades speak, I was wondering, does David Rosenberg want to make some brief, I see you, Jania, if David Rosenberg wants to make some brief comments at this stage, because you would have time to summarize at the end of the meeting. So if you want to speak now, David, that's fine. And then you'll be followed by the four speakers I've indicated. And it's seen also now that Jan has indicated he wants to speak. So David.
I'll just pick up, I'll just comment on a few points for now. Because it's all been very interesting. The far right and how it relates to these issues, because I don't think it's right to say, although that significant sections, particularly in Western Europe, but not just in Western Europe, of the far right have now become very fanatical pro-Israel supporters alongside their traditional anti-Semitism. It's not quite right if you take a more global view on it, particularly in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, in Poland and Hungary. You've got far right groups who are both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, because they regard a right-wing anti-Zionism. They regard any Jewish collective activity as some kind of conspiracy and dangerous. So you have got, and also it was interesting what Andros was saying about Greece, because also I hear from other people in Greece that some of the Greek far right are more the old school far right, who are opposed to both Jews and Zionism for the reasons I just said. It caused a rupture actually in Britain actually in 2001 when you had 9/11 happen. John Tyndall, who was the old school leader of the far right, he kind of sympathized and supported 9/11 because it was an attack on the evil empire, as he calls it, America, which he says is controlled by the Jews. Other people in the far right just latched onto 9/11 as the perfect opportunity to really ratchet up Islamophobia. And there was a kind of bit of open warfare within the far right in Britain going on over that. Just to mention also about Argentina was mentioned, very interesting case. In the late 1970s, early 80s, when you had the junta in Argentina, a semi-fascist regime, there were thousands and thousands of people who were, quotes, disappeared by that regime. More than 10% of them were Jews, who made up 1% of the population. And yet Israel was supplying the arms to that regime that were being used against the Jews. So as for Israel claiming it can solve any anti-Semitism, in that case, it was actually helping the anti-Semites. The stuff about possible collaboration and co-protesting among Israelis and Palestinians is really interesting. And there are some good examples from right now where that kind of thing happens. There's a media collective with both Israeli and Palestinians who do excellent reporting, and that's called Plus 972. I'd really recommend people to look out for their coverage. And also there's a very interesting group called the Green Olive Collective, who do amazing work, Palestinians and Israelis together. They're a kind of progressive tour organization, but it's not like somebody taking you on a walk for 2 hours. I do that kind of thing as a radical history tour guide. But what they do is like you might spend 4 or 5 days in a Palestinian village with the people there, learning in depth about their situation. There's also groups that are of Israeli left-wingers who are spending time staying over in the homes of Palestinians to help defend those homes from the settlers. And some of them have been very badly beaten up by the settlers. There was one other point I was going to mention. No, I'll leave it at that for the moment. But here's some more contributions and hopefully come in again at the end.
Yeah, thanks, David. Now I have 5 comrades have indicated they want to speak. Now we don't have a huge amount of time to enable 5 speakers to speak. So I'm asking comrades to be very restrained in the time they use up, because we must also allow David time to sum up the general discussion towards the end. So Nigel, followed by Julia.
Yeah, thanks, Finbar, and thank you for the talk. Just saying, if you come back again, David, could you talk a little bit class and the Holocaust? You did mention it, but I just wondered, how significant that was, because as I understood it, there were Jews able to buy their way out of the situation, but obviously working class Jews couldn't, and I think that was quite an important feature of it. Just coming to the current situation, I think was standing on protests and vigils around the Palestine currently. It's quite interesting. We have, because I'm from Halifax, which is in the north of England, and there's a fairly big Asian community in the town, and the Asian community has been very active in the vigils. And it's my first real opportunity to be talking with that community, because I'm fairly new to the town, so getting to know them. I've not been here very long myself. And one of the responses I had right at the very start was, well, we want to kick the Jews out of Palestine. To which I said, where will they go? And the person who said it went, oh, I've not thought about that. So we're talking about a fairly basic level of kind of understanding of the issues, emotional, not thought through. I won't comment any more on what the origin of those ideas might have been, but the person I was talking to was very happy to discuss it. It wasn't that we couldn't discuss it. I mean, she wasn't Palestinian. Her origins were from East Africa. So that raises a point about simplicity in the discussion, and I would agree with Andros that my impression is, and it is only an impression, David and comrades, it is only an impression, that people on the right support Israel, and other people generally support the Palestinians. That's my impression, and that's from abuse that's hurled at us and comments that are made and those kind of things of people coming past. Now, this could be very far from the truth, so it's quite subjective, but that's my impression. A big concern is Starmer's, in my opinion, Islamophobic position on this. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, if you listen to his LBC interview, he was actually Islamophobic. He was talking about the absolute right of Israel to do what the hell it wanted. And then at the end, he had the right as long as it's within international law. But it was appalling. And if you look at the statutes of the Labour Party, they're very clear on anti-Semitism, but they're not very clear on other forms of racism at all. So, you know, that shows, if you like, a really concerning the union fudging. They're not. And the reason I'm talking about these issues is because there's a bigger issue for me, because when the left gets confused about where it stands, I'm not describing the Labour Party as left, obviously, but when the left gets confused about where it stands, it seems to be put in a position that's put also by the right, we do have a real problem, because we have a problem of a slide into reaction. And I'll use one example of where that's been really clear in the United Kingdom, because the left took a quite an unfortunate position on the trans issue recently, within the last couple of years. And the perception around the trans issue has gone, in my opinion, catastrophically from objectivity around the issue, clarity around the issue, and also towards polarization on the issue, and a deterioration in people's openness to difference. Let's put it that way, which is really concerning, because that's happened really fast, and it's happened because the left has had, in my opinion, a really poor and confused position around this, and the debates have become really toxic. Is a word I don't like, but I'll use it. Toxic, and it's led to a now I think that can happen around in terms of racism, and I think it can happen around Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as well. If the left is confused and divided, that leaves an opportunity for the right, and it becomes a bit of a feeding frenzy. So the situation got in the UK, when previously the trade unions done excellent work around anti-racism, and including the Labour Party. To be fair to the Labour Party, I would say that's the Labour Party's played its part there, historically, not currently. But the Labour Party now has slid away from those positions towards patriotism, nationalism, jingoism, and the rest of it. This is worrying territory in a country where we have, looking at the evidence, made good progress on these issues over the last 40 years around racism, you know, attitudes to difference and attitudes to race. I can't go into that any deeper, but there's loads of evidence to support that. So these are concerning times. So that's a kind of broadening out of the just thought I'd put that in because that's something I'm concerned about here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Now we're running out of time, so I'll take the four comrades who have indicated and ask them to be fairly short. So that's Julia, followed by Kieran, followed by Jan, followed by Dominic, and then we have to leave time for David to summarize. So please be restrained in your contributions. So, Julia.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I will be brief, and partly because David has picked up one of the points that I was going to come in on, which was about the Israeli left, which actually is very, very beleaguered at the moment, and the state is being extremely draconian in its actions against not just people defending Palestinians, but one person said to us, he's more worried about what he puts on Facebook than actually his physical activism because of the way the state is policing anybody who's remotely dissident from what the government's doing. And in fact, immediately after this meeting, I'm going to go to a webinar organized by Green Olive Tours, the group that David mentioned, who have got a speaker from Combatants for Peace. That is people who have been soldiers and have served in the occupied territories and have come to the conclusion that that is not right, and they're not only refusing to do it, but they're speaking out about it, which is a very, very powerful thing to do in a country where conscription is actually the bedrock of your future life. And if you don't serve in the army, that has implications not just for the time that it happens, but really for the rest of your life, your employability, your relationships, and everything. But I wanted to pick up a question that I thought Andros was asking, but I'm not sure if he was, which is about the left amongst Jews. And I think what's really, really interesting at the moment is that in Jewish diaspora communities, which have always been diverse and have always been conflicted along many lines, along class lines, along political lines around Zionism and anti-Zionism, and a whole number of other issues. There's always been an attempt to kind of create a facade of unity, and the devices that we know are used to create that facade. Zionism is one, and it's been a very, very powerful one in the wake of the Nazi genocide and the aftermath of that, and the refugees washing around all over Europe for years, many, many years after the camps were liberated. The conflicts within the community have now been very much exposed, and Jewish people in the diaspora are being forced at the moment to make a moral choice and a political choice, and depending on their own political background, what underpins that choice. But when you see on your television screens every day what we're seeing, even people who have been kind of dogged supporters of Israel for all kinds of reasons that I think are actually not that easy to make assumptions about, some of them, quite unexpectedly to me, have jumped far to the right and are saying the most unthinkable things about what's happening in Gaza. But a lot of people are actually coming on the demonstrations with us as Jews, and having a Jewish bloc is giving them the confidence to know that there are other people supporting them, that they're not a lone voice. Because again, the implications of making that decision within your family are quite big for a lot of people. I'm beyond the age where I have to a worry about what my parents or my cousins or whoever might think. And I've been through all that all my life. But I think for young people, the idea of being severed from their family and severed from their community, which is what breaking with Zionism has quite often meant for people in the past, that's a massive decision. I'm not saying that you shouldn't make it, but in the Jewish blocs on these demonstrations, there's such a variety of people that it is what we're seeing is people actually being enabled to think about what all this means and to make a stand for what they know to be right and against what they know to be wrong. And I'll just finish with a really interesting conversation that I had with a very young member of the Jewish bloc yesterday on the demonstration. And he came up to me and he said, I think we're related. And I said, you know, we went through the... David says he can't hear me. Can other people hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. That it turns out that we're kind of distant cousins, but my family had one side of it was this kind of very pucker, very prominent Zionist family. And that's the bit that he comes from. And the bit that I grew up in, I was in a Zionist youth movement, and you know, I went through this whole process of breaking with it. And what he told me was that his grandmother, who's a really kind of well-known, slightly left of center, but very kind of absolutely riveted to Zionism, that she's actually signing petitions about in opposition to the Israeli government now. She's not doing it very publicly, but I just think that that's a kind of indication that there's a whole mass of people in the middle of the Jewish community that are on the move. And you know, it may not be seem significant to people who are outside the community, but I do think what's happening is that the right has always operated under cover of saying that all Jews support this, and those that don't are just marginal and they're not real Jews and they're not of any significance. But actually, that image is being shattered now, and it's really important because it affects the way that they can use anti-Semitism and claim that things are anti-Semitism when they actually aren't. When there's 400, 500, 1,000 Jewish people publicly on a demonstration like these ones we've seen, with their placards saying, "Not in our name, Jews opposed to genocide, Jewish bloc for the Palestinians," and all the rest of it. You know, there's a disjuncture that people have to deal with. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Julia, for making that point, which I'm sure comrades will find very encouraging in their own activities in the movement. Now, as I say, we're very limited for time, but our next speaker is Kieran.
Okay, well, thank you, Finn. I'll try and be quick. I've looked forward to this lead off all week, you know, and I wasn't disappointed. It was very, very good, and thank you, David. I have a question, and I'll ask the question, and then I'll give something of a exposition of why I'm asking the question. But it might seem like a daft question, might seem like a silly question. It's not necessary, but I would like you, David, just to take a moment or two to define Zionism. It's something I've thought about a lot, and I can find a dictionary definition with ease. I can do it on my phone now, but that's less important and less helpful than what it means in the real living sense of the word. And I know many people on the left, for them, Zionism does equate with racism. It equates with, you know, currently genocide. It equates with many things that are negative, which implies that it's a wholly negative and invalid ideology, which has you know, it's got no basis to exist in that sense. And on the right, of course, Zionism is equated with support for the right of the Israeli state to exist. And I think the truth is not quite either of those two things. And I think it is important in a discussion like this to start with definitions and then to think it through. And everything you said, David, is very interesting and helpful. but I was thinking at every point, what are the implications for today? What are the programmatic implications of everything you said? Obviously, you had a certain task today, so you couldn't see all of that through to a conclusion. But my comments are about here, is about Ulster, about Northern Ireland, which has already been referenced by Roger, and the quote that he used. And I always drive on a Sunday during the course of this meeting, 100 miles across Northern Ireland, and I pass through towns and villages. And each town and village, there'll be flags flying from the lampposts, and some towns it'll be the Union Jack, the British flag, and side by side with that, the flag of Israel, the Star of David. In other towns and villages, it'll be the Irish tricolour, the flag of the Irish Republic, and flying alongside that, the Palestinian flag. And the same towns and villages, I could predict exactly what flags would fly, and it could have been predicted 400 years ago in 1624 because of the settlement program, the colonial program of British imperialism, English imperialism as it was then in Ireland. So there is much that can be said about Ireland, as there can be said about Israel and Palestine, that is meaningful and accurate and helpful, but it only takes us so far. So, for example, in the question of Zionism, if I just speak for a moment about unionism, Ulster unionism, now most people on this call and everywhere probably equate Ulster unionism with, sort of reactionary ideology. It's a negative, needs to be swept away, pro-imperialist, and there's truth in all of that. Ulster unionism meant, for example, from 1921 to 1972, a one-party state in Northern Ireland. Housing was denied to Catholics, jobs were denied, votes were gerrymandered in order to ensure that a Catholic vote was worth less than a Protestant vote. It might have been called an apartheid state that originated in a colonial project. All of that is true. And there were people who called themselves unionists throughout the last 50 years who went out to deliberately slaughter Catholics because they were Catholics in order to terrorize the population. You might argue with genocidal intent, though it never reached a certain pitch as it has in Gaza. But to say all of those things, but not to go further, is insufficient. Because I will go into work tomorrow, and the people I work alongside are from a Protestant background, and most of them would regard themselves as unionists. And by unionists, they mean they have an attachment to the state of Britain. They want to remain part of Britain. Some of them are also trade unionists. So they're unionists and they're trade unionists, and they fight side by side with Catholics with a different national identity. And we all know here about the dual consciousness, how you can believe you have a national identity and a national consciousness alongside class consciousness, and our historic role as Marxists is to emphasize the latter and diminish the former. And I think about what's happened in Israel and Gaza a lot, as all comrades here do, and I think these things through a lot. And it does puzzle me just exactly what is Zionism? How can it be defined today in 2024? And I guess, David, is there any such thing as somebody in the world who can describe themselves as Zionists and not by definition be a racist or genocidal, and simply in a genuine way wants to see an Israeli state, a Jewish state, and does not have malign intent against Israeli Arabs? I could say a lot more about this, obviously, in a longer discussion, so it's maybe a little bit pushing the argument, and obviously it's not entirely balanced because of the lack of time. But thanks again, David, for the contribution, or for the lead-off.
Thank you, Kieran. Our final two speakers are Jan from Sweden, followed by Dominic, and then David Rosenberg's summing up. So, Jan.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank David Rosenberg for his very interesting lead-off. I have one thing to say and one question. Well, I would like to underline that I am also very critical to the tendency amongst many who by every right participate in protests against the war crimes carried out by the Israeli Defense Forces and government today. The tendency to accept the slogan of "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." I'm not of the opinion that you should accept that slogan, and because of reasons that others have explained today and also previously. I have a maybe very, or to some degree, very controversial question, and that is about calling Israel for an apartheid regime. Well, when it comes to, I've tried to to do some research about this question, and I would definitely agree that when it comes to the West Bank, the Palestinian Arabs are treated like they were living in an apartheid regime way. I don't doubt that. I would agree with a statement that Palestinian Arabs who lives in the West Bank are treated like apartheid. But I am not sure it would be right to say that Arabs living within the Israeli borders before the war 1967, having Israeli citizenship, are treated in a way that deserves being called like they were living in an apartheid regime. In situations like this, with terrible things going on, and when you are without real power to change it, there is a tendency to punish the forces that you cannot stop by using words that are very hard. And I would like David Rosenberg to comment about this.
Thank you, Jan. Now, our final speaker before David's summing up is Dominic, and we're hoping to finish the discussion by 6 o'clock. So, Dominic, or John?
John speaking.
John, right, John, go ahead.
A few points I'd like to make. One, prior to October the 7th, there was huge uproar in Israel at basically saying that Netanyahu should go because of his corrupt approach to Israeli politics. Just on two issues. One, from the river to the sea actually represents, in my opinion, a summary of Zionist imperialism or Zionist aims, and that is for the river to the sea to become a Jewish country. And that's where, if you like, internationally, the whole host of organizations have actually labeled Israel as an apartheid regime, because there are differentiations in the law, etc. But coming post October the 7th, Netanyahu, who was being shown the door by the majority of Israeli people, now is the leader of a war cabinet, and the war cabinets tend very much to be my country right or wrong. We can argue about the issues when the war is over. Netanyahu is steadfastly opposed to the release of the hostages because that would require some form of ceasefire. And definitely, as far as Netanyahu is concerned, he's created a monster, not just in Hamas, because he belittled and ridiculed the PLO and, if you like, promoted Hamas. But what he's done as well, he's created another monster, and that monster is the settlers. Because what has happened in the West Bank is that some 750,000 settlers are there, and they have got that settler mentality, whether they like it or not. They might be the most liberal people going initially, but when it comes to the fact that they have got to decide, are you with us or against us in getting rid of the Palestinians? And I think as far as Netanyahu's concerned, he's putting tremendous pressure on not only the Jews in Israel, but also the Jewish diaspora, because he has created an absolutely monstrous regime. In the West Bank, when they raid Palestinian towns, they not only raid houses and then destroy them, they also rip up the roads. They create, they destroy the infrastructure of water pipes, sewage pipes, etc. In Gaza, they've now bombed nearly every dwelling in the place, so there's little left standing. It's a now huge tent city, and on today's news, they were even bombing the tents. So he's making it my country right or wrong to the Jewish people. And I think the bravery of the Jewish people who stand against him has really got to be admired. And I think there will be texts in, if you like, the social media that will be anti-Semitic. But I think as far as many people on the left are concerned, they will look at the Jews who stand up and say, not in my name. And that's the way I'm optimistic about it, because on every Saturday night in Tel Aviv, there are huge demonstrations, mostly to get, the hostages back, but also a growing, although very small at the moment, attitude towards Netanyahu, because he's dragging, if you like, Israel into an absolute morass as, if you like, the leader of a war cabinet. And I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Thank you, John. Over to you now, David.
Thank you very much for those contributions. And my internet kept failing a few times, so I didn't only heard part of what Kieran asked and part of what Julia said, but I think I heard most of the others. I'm going to mention two concerns I have that haven't, I suppose, particularly come up in these comments, and then I will try and also address some of the comments. One of the things that really worries me at the moment is the impact all of this is having on relations between Jews and other minorities in Britain. Because I think other minorities in Britain who are oppressed and discriminated against in all kinds of ways are having a very instinctive support for the Palestinians, and the marches have been incredibly multicultural, particularly in London. I don't know so much what happens elsewhere, but it's a very significant feature of that. That there's that multicultural solidarity for Palestine, and yet the self-defined leaders of the Jewish community seem determined to pull the Jewish community as far as possible to the furthest right positions and align themselves with the hard right in Britain, and that makes things very difficult. So we need to, but anti-Semitism is a real thing. And Roger was mentioning it on social media. I could give all kinds of examples. I'll give one for now, but one that really shocked me was somebody who has always published completely left comment on their Twitter feed suddenly was retweeting a comment by Nick Griffin, former leader of the BNP, on the basis that he'd made an anti-Israel comment that was a veiled anti-Semitism comment, basically. And that people can't see through that was really disturbing. The other point, which hasn't come up, but really I think people need to know about, is the situation in Germany. In Germany, there is terrible repression of anyone speaking up for Palestine. It's really hard for anyone, Palestinian, Arab, other minority, and Jews in Germany, because there's a very interesting group called Jüdische Stimme, which is a joint Israeli and Palestinian, Jewish and Palestinian group in Germany, and they have the German state is banning their demonstrations. They're arresting Jews in Germany again, but for a completely different reason, as in the 30s, yeah. But for speaking up for Palestine. In general, I'm very pessimistic about the next few months in Palestine and how much more the death count will grow. A few specific points that came up in the discussion. I mean, the very first points that were made by Steve Zeltzer, who I think admittedly didn't hear some of what I had to say. I do disagree quite a lot with his way of putting the whole thing around Zionists and Nazis. There is some real material to deal with, to look at there, but I think you have to keep the power relations between the Nazi state and the Zionist organizations in Germany. And Zionists were a minority in Germany amongst German Jews anyway. But also, as I say, the actions of some Nazis attempting, some Zionists attempting some sort of collaboration was also critiqued by other Zionists. And that, in a way, touches on the issue about class and the Holocaust that was raised. Whether Jews could buy their way out, not very much at all. Really, in the end, the totality of Nazism was so powerful, and the victims of it were across the classes of the Jewish world, and there were what were called Jewish councils appointed by the Nazis that included some of the wealthier, some of the more prominent people in the community, and they were used as an intermediary to pass on the Nazi laws onto the Jewish population, but almost at gunpoint. And some of those managed to do some subversion of that. Others felt if they cooperated, they could at least string things out for a while. But in the end, they were the victims as well. It didn't really help. The point about the Jews within pre-67 Israel that was raised by the Swedish comrade. I mean, the 2018 nation state law that was passed by Israel. This is 6 years ago now. That codified a lot of existing discrimination that was already happening against those populations within Israel. It makes it very clear that only Jews are entitled to full self-determination within the area, within the land that is either in Israel or controlled by Israel. And that discrimination had been going on since 1948, and it's the legal groups, B'Tselem, who've been mentioned. They are the ones who are saying now there is a situation of Jewish supremacy being pursued. That is one system of oppression, whether it's in the occupied territories or whether it's in Israel proper. The issues that came up about trade unions, and which includes the stuff about the Histadrut. The Histadrut are not the only kids on the block, if you like. And there's a very interesting organization called Kavla Oved. I can send Roger some details about that. Maybe he can circulate it about them. But they are an independent organization who support marginalized workers. Those marginalized workers include Palestinians, include poorer Jewish Israelis, and include also migrant workers in Israel. And it's campaigning and fighting to defend their rights. Last couple of things I want to say. I want to echo what Julia was saying about the growth of the Jewish left and the growth of the Jewish bloc on the demonstrations and in wider activity. What to me is, there's two things in particular that are really encouraging about that. One is the age range. These are people from their 20s to their 80s and all the steps in between. It's completely cross-generational. And people from us at the moment, 11 different organizations. But it also, and I was one of the co-founders of the bloc, and we established a principle of unity in action, that we don't have to have uniformity of thought. Yeah, we have a set of things that we do agree on, and we work very well on those together. We don't have these big ideological clashes about things that we may disagree about. We put that to one side of, quite a lot, and focus on the main things which we do hold in common. And that feels very healthy. And we're also organizing social events as well. So we're not just meeting each other across Zoom in serious meetings. We're also finding ways to relax and enjoy each other's company. And that, I think that's really important. The issues that Kieran was raising, and I'm sorry I didn't hear all his contribution, but he was also asking about the programmatic things. What are ways forward? What I would particularly point to is finding a way to keep open all links between progressive Israelis and Palestinian groups, and some of those might be more progressive than others, but I think it's really important to keep all those possibilities open. The Israeli state really wants to clamp down on any of that contact. Also, we have to, and one particular group that needs support are the conscientious objectors movement in Israel, the Refusers Solidarity Network. That is a major challenge to the Israeli state when young kids who are supposed to leave school and go straight into the army stand in demonstrations and burn their call-up papers for the army. And that is what happened in the demonstrations against Netanyahu before October the 7th. And I think that movement really, really needs a lot of support. And I think there has been this rise in anti-Semitism, and there's been also a big rise in Islamophobia. We have to be very aware of that and react strongly to that, and show as much push the anti-racist and anti-fascist movements to recognize that as being a really, really important thing right now. We have to maintain as much unity as possible against racism and fascism wherever they appear. And now we've had for the first time, we've had very racist Israeli politicians, but we've got self-declared fascists in the Israeli cabinet right now. And that is a really serious matter. And there are people in Israel who are trying to counter that. And the whole question of, do they define themselves as Zionist, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist? In some ways, it's not the crucial question there. We might think about it as the crucial question more outside, but there it's a matter of who is supporting what the government's doing, who is opposing what the government's doing. Yeah, and finding those different fault lines and making sure we can support people that are engaged in some way in progressive actions. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks, David. I'm sure the comrades would all agree that David has made a significant contribution to our understanding of the issues that affect Israel and the broader Middle East. So I want to thank him for that, both in terms of his opening contribution and his two summing up points. I want to thank all the comrades who spoke. It's been a very high level of discussion. The comrades who did speak have thought about the issues, have considered the questions in detail, and have brought that understanding to all of us. So we all gain from discussions of this nature, because we now go away and think more deeply about the questions that have been raised. So thanks again, David, for your contributions, and thanks to all the comrades who spoke in the discussion. So with that, we'll end the discussion on Zionism, myth and reality. And Roger, do you want to make some points about our discussion next week?
Yes, thanks. Before I do, I'd like to explain to comrades there was a glitch with the chat line, whatever you call it today. For some reason, people couldn't pass messages to other comrades, but only to me as the host. And I assure you that's not a censorship on our part. I think some comrades suspected it might be. We want fullest dialogue or conversation between all of us, and we'll make sure that the settings are adjusted accordingly in future. Next week, we're having a very important and interesting discussion about the growth over the last decade or so of new left parties. We've had Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, Die Linke in Germany, La France Insoumise in France, the Corbyn and Sanders phenomena, and so on. And all of them started with great hope and ended with hopes dashed. And Comrade Andros from Greece will be leading a discussion on that issue. So I hope everybody will come. It's very good to see today comrades from all over the world, from India, from America, from South Africa, and all points in between. So I hope David and Julia, I hope you'll come, and other comrades from the Jewish Socialist Group. Please give us your emails. I'll put you on the email list so you'll get notices. We meet every Sunday at 4 o'clock London time. So thanks, comrades.
Comrades, just one point. Roger maybe should have made the point that, look, we've had an international campaign to defend Comrade Marcia, who spoke out about conditions at Eagle Night Watch in Swakopmund in Namibia. And we now have something like 22 statements from trade unions, from individuals, from the labor movement generally, which have now gone to the minister there and to the employer directly. In the next few days, we will probably hear about whether she's been able to regain her position. She's been suspended, victimized for making statements against what the company has been doing. And we hope that this campaign and the action of comrades inside Namibia will achieve a reinstatement and a victory for the workers. Many thanks for those comrades who have made the contributions. It's so much appreciated. That's
it, comrades. So enjoy the evening. Thanks for your attendance.